So that means that these divine acts that Adam and Eve performed are never wasted. As Augustine says, he will condemn the bad we have done, even the souls in purgatory, but he will save what he himself did in us. So when we live in the divine will or pray in the divine will for the reparation of the souls in purgatory, or even for our living loved ones or ourselves, we are in the divine will allowing God to perform his acts in us. Let's be clear. We're not doing these acts. God is doing them in us. This is what the whole divine will is about, and what makes it different from the holiness experienced by the saints before Louisa. They performed in their human natures perfect Christian virtues and acts, but they were not performed by God. They were performed by the saint. This is made clear in the Catholic Encyclopedia when defining grace. And when defining grace, it cites St. Charles Bellarmine, who defined grace as God's remote habitual operation in the creature, where the creature performs the act, the saint performs the act, but God remotely assists in that operation. That's grace. This is the standard of holiness before the divine will was actualized in the first soul conceived in sin, namely Louisa. All the saints performed their own acts. God did not. In the divine will, God is doing the act. It's not you're operating in your will, the Son in the intellect, the Spirit in the memory. This is a divine triune psychosomatic act. So it's not just an operation in the soul of the Trinity, but also in the body. Jesus tells Louisa before Adam and Eve sinned, the Father not only operated in his will, but palpitated in his heartbeat. The Son not only moved and operated in his intellect, but flowed through his life. So this is important. And this is why whenever we talk about living in the divine will, we're always reminded that God is the operator. We are not. Having said that, transferring a little bit to humility, whenever Christ did anything, including in humble acts, like in the gospel today when he told, in the Gospel of Luke, this is the third time Luke in the last 3 weeks on Sunday readings presents us with Christ and the Pharisees locking horns. Chapter 7, chapter 11, chapter 13. And here he talks about Christ in response to the Pharisees not taking the first place at a banquet or a dinner, and not inviting their parents, the rich people, but inviting the blind, the lame, the poor, the outcast, etc. Because he says their reward will come at the end of time, at the resurrection of the dead, the general judgment. Don't expect your reward now if you want to be rewarded then, because if you're rewarded now, you won't have a reward then. That's the theme. But the humility Christ exemplified was not a human virtue, it was a divine virtue, because these acts that Christ performed in his human nature were done by his divine will. They're called in theology theandric acts. Theandric, theos means God, andros means man. Theos, andros. So it's a God-man operation in that order. So God performed all the acts Christ in his divine nature, that contains a divine will, intellect, memory, performed all of these acts in his human nature. So his human nature cooperated with his divine nature, not the other way around. The divine nature performed the acts, and the human nature cooperated with the operation of the divinity, similar to the way God operated in Adam and Eve before sin. When we do our acts in the divine will, including acts of humility, the same dynamism occurs. And our humility in these moments, when we're exemplifying it in many ways, can overflow and impact others as well. Jesus tells Louisa that whenever you perform an act in the divine will, my divine will, which is light, not only imbues your finite acts with an eternal quality, but it overflows on the outside, to the left, to the right, before you, behind you, for the betterment of others. Why is that? Because the divine will is flowing in and through all creation at the same time. And whenever we enter into the divine will, we partake of that multi location of God's operation. I was going to say bilocation, but it's a multi-location, because we're not just in two places, we're in all things. So he tells Louisa, and I'll see if I can find this quote, that whenever a soul performs a divine act in my will, all creation, not just one or two creatures, all creation stands in attention. Let me see if I could pull this up. It's a beautiful quote. And the reason I want to share with you is because I was stuck on how to translate this. You know, how to translate this expression in Italian. I found it. It is volume 22, July 16th, 1927. Jesus tells Louisa, my daughter, when the soul prays in my divine will, all things and created beings stand at attention. They stop what they are doing and remain in complete silence, and while all remain intent on admiring one act done in the divine will, they collectively follow its prayer, its power calls, and impacts everything in such a way that all things concur in whatever this soul accomplishes. If one were to compare all other prayers united together with one simple prayer said in my will, this one prayer alone would surpass them all, because it possesses a divine will along with its immense power and its incalculable value. I myself feel invested with this prayer. I feel invested with its power, and recognizing it as the prayer of my own will, it becomes one with me. Let me talk about, in simple terms, the different ways in which we live in God's divine will. Jesus tells Louisa in volume 11 that there is an imperfect, perfect, and complete, and Mary talks about this as well in the book for the month of May. Now, let me direct you to that passage. Volume 11, June 29th, 1914. Jesus gave Louisa a vision of objects on the surface, inside, and at the bottom of the ocean. And he tells her, the sea symbolizes my immensity. And while the objects that she saw in the sea differ in size, they symbolize the souls who live in my will, but with different ways of living. Some live on the surface, others below the surface, and yet others completely lose themselves in my will, all varying according to how they live in my will. Some souls live in my will in an imperfect way, others in a more perfect way, and yet others reach the point of completely losing themselves in my will. So here the Lord talks about imperfect, perfect, complete. So when we are doing venial sins, like you say all the time, and we are trying to do our acts in the divine will, this can be living imperfectly. Why? Because venial sins do not cut us off from the grace of God. They are like clouds, they are like obstacles, but they don't cut us off completely from the light, the operation of God's will in us. God is still operating in a soul in venial sin. A soul in venial sin can still go to communion. But they should do their best to try to eliminate that. That is why at the beginning of the Mass we have the penitential rite that takes away venial sin, not mortal sin. So a soul can be living imperfectly in the divine will and intermittently committing venial sin. Now there's a difference between indeliberate and deliberate venial sin. Jesus makes this clear in volume 1 to Louisa. He gave her the grace toward the end of volume 1 of no longer committing deliberate venial sin. What is the difference? Indeliberate venial sin is something that I do either out of impulse, because I have not yet developed the virtues sufficiently. Somebody says something bad to me and I snap back and say something bad to them. I didn't deliberate, I didn't premeditate, it just came out. It shouldn't have had my virtues been more developed. That's an indeliberate sin, but it's still a sin, but it's not as offensive as something that I do on purpose with deliberation. So Jesus gave Louisa the grace of ceasing to commit all deliberate sin at the end of volume 1 in her early 20s. But she continued to fall back. He was patient with her, and we find this even after spiritual marriage. But it was less and less deliberate to the point in which it disappeared altogether. So there is an imperfect way, a more perfect way, and then a complete way. So it's not as if it's one room and there's a door and that room's over and there's another door, and then it's not like that. Degrees overlap, just like stages overlap. You can be in a stage of purification and illumination and unification at the same time. John of the Cross talks about this. But more emphasis is given to one than the other as you progress, till finally the former disappears altogether. So you go from purgation, or purification, to illumination. And there's a little overlapping, till finally purification may cease altogether, or it may come again. Padre Pio is a living testament to how a soul can be a saint in the state of divinization. He lived in the divine will. He talks about giving his fiat to God, which he read Louisa's writings, and at the same time be purified. Even in the state of divinization, intermittently he was having purification. How can you say this? He was saint. One time he was being beaten by the devil, and his angel appeared to him. But it was late. According to Padre Pio, his angel was too late. His angel was praising God while Padre Pio was being beaten. And he was like, offering God Padre Pio's virtues of suffering to God to increase the glory of God, accidental glory of all creatures and God. And he was coming to Padre Pio and he's saying, what's taking you so long? But the angel, he wasn't late really. But he was doing the will of God because God was allowing Padre Pio, and the angel obeyed that will of God, to endure these sufferings for the salvation and purification of other souls. So Padre Pio was taking upon himself in the state of divinization the sufferings of others due to their sins to help purify them. So he was experiencing their purification for them and their sufferings for them. So in this sense, a saint can experience purification, not for themselves, but for others. Padre Pio did that. If a soul is habitually committing venial sin, that's an imperfect way of living. And as they move more and more away from that, it becomes less frequent. They're approaching that perfect point to finally the complete point. And Louisa experienced these three stages as well. She didn't arrive at that complete stage until she was 35. I think it was November 16th, 1900. Thank you.
So my question is about using the correct terms when I pray in a divine will. You already actually mentioned bilocation and multi-location. And my question is, when I do rounds in the morning, the correct way for me would be to say that my soul multi-locates to all the acts that Jesus created. Is that right? Not bilocates?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
It's bilocate, it's both. It's bilocate in the sense that your soul, which is in one place in your body, can now be in another place. But it can be in more than just another place. So in addition to bilocation, it's multi-location. And we could say it's bilocation in as much as God is in us and we are in God. In that sense, there's a bilocation. And once we enter into God's one eternal act, then he multilocates us. We don't do it. He does it. Louisa was not even aware of this, I should say, the effects of this multilocation, because she didn't know where all her acts were going. And Jesus told her, it's not for you to know now. But he respected her intention. So if she prayed for a specific place to avoid a chastisement, let's say he told her about, or the outcome of a war, like between Africa and Ethiopia, which he also talked to her about, she wanted to mitigate the effects, she would apply her sufferings, even her acts, to those people there to offer up reparation to God for their sins. That would draw down God's wrath. And God would apply that. And she did not see in detail or how her acts were impacting theirs. Jesus did all this for her. So she, in faith, said, I will apply it by my intention, and the rest is up to God. So when we multi-locate, we do the same thing. We apply our intention, let's say, to the souls of the past, present, future, There's no way on God's green earth that I know every soul of the past or of the future. Nobody here does. And we leave that up to God, and He applies it accordingly.
Thank you.
Father, staying on this theme of praying in the divine will, can I ask you, is there a danger in becoming too scrupulous about the words we use? Because it seems like praying in the divine will is almost this intimate thing. And maybe when you think about how much is dependent on the words that we use versus what God is doing through us.
There is that tendency, I think, among some who, out of love, don't want to miss anything. And Saint Hannibal tells us that there are no formulas in the divine will. And yet, he asked Louisa to compose a formula, namely the consecration in the divine will, which he did.